in Python from Robert Kluin and Beau Lyddon, so please give them a warm welcome.
Thanks. All right, so I'm Robert, and this is Beau. We were also supposed to have been joined by our friend Nick Joyce, but he got hung up due to some minor immigration issues.
So a little about us. We are actually pure backend guys at a company called Web Filings. We spend most of our life in low-level APIs, and quite frankly, that life is pretty good, except that every once in a while we have to foray into front-end development. It's actually pretty unavoidable these days. And once you do that, you're starting to deal with what we call assets, or your JavaScript, CSS, images, and that's pretty foreign territory for us. But generally, when we go to do things, we like to follow best practices. Especially here, since this code you're putting out actually goes down to the client and has pretty big impacts on your performance and security. And more importantly, today things are moving so fast, if you're not in this environment constantly, it's really hard to keep up.
Yeah, that's right. Today we're getting more and more rich client-side applications, and those make heavy use of things like JavaScript and CSS, and we have to have a way to manage those and facilitate the development of these as we increase the number of assets that, as we split that code from single large massive JavaScript files into smaller, more manageable modules. That's great for the developers writing the code to have it laid out so that it's modular and compact, but it's bad for all of the end users who have to download dozens of extra little files.
So that means we're going to do some compilation and minification of our files, which means compiles, which for those of us in the Python world is pretty foreign. So generally when we're kind of dealing with this, that means for me, like I start creating bash scripts or Python scripts, keeping it all together, and it becomes kind of a pain. Then you start throwing in, going from Coffeescript to JavaScript, then minifying that, going back and forth between dev and prod, and it gets pretty painful. So we assume there's got to be something out there. So even once you're going, a lot of times, since we're not the best front-end developers, we've got that whole script, we've got it compiling, and then we go to refresh our browser, and all of a sudden we have JavaScript errors.
So at that point, we pop up Chrome DevTools, and what do you know? We had compressed JavaScript. That's great. That makes it a lot of fun to debug. So at that point, that's when we go ask our dev manager if we can get an intern or if we can get a contract front-end guy.
So this is what we would ideally see. We want to debug with our code being exactly how we coded it, so we can bounce back and forth and know where we are. The problem is so now we got a script for production that's going to compress, and then a script for development. We're bouncing back and forth. I've got to mess with build scripts. It's kind of a pain. I really don't want to deal with this. At the same time, I need to make sure the customer gets the best experience. And outside of our environment, there's a lot of things being done. There's source maps and other dev tools. Even the Chrome tools now have the ability to expand out. It's nice, but it's not quite a one-to-one mapping, although source maps are getting really, really close. So doing all of that, we kind of went out and tried to see if there are other better solutions.
Yeah, so this is obviously a very common problem that's faced with people programming in all kinds of languages. So this would be a good spot just to go over what are some of the existing options so that you understand how we're proposing is different.
So in the JavaScript world, you have things like Grunt, which is actually more of a full-featured automation system. It's really just a complete build tool, similar to like a Maven. It's actually pretty slick, especially considering it's JavaScript. There's quite a bit of activity, plugins, and users out there. And then there's a couple other libraries like Mincer, just kind of a port of the Ruby sprockets, and Brewer.js. These are a little more focused just on the asset management. And these are great options, especially if you're a JavaScript guy, but we aren't, so we're going to move on.
Yeah, so another common language is Ruby. If you're coding in Ruby, you're at the wrong conference. But if you do have to deal with Ruby, you may be familiar with Sprockets. It's their low-level asset, kind of asset compilation and serving service. So they've now built something called Rails Asset Pipeline. It's built with using Sprockets, and it's actually integrated into Rails. So that makes it pretty slick to use if you are using a Rails app. And there's another option called Jam It. That's from the Document Cloud guys. They're the ones who did Coffeescript and Backbone, for example. So obviously, many languages have some sort of asset management system.
And actually, if you go out and start searching, those tend to be the examples you get. There's not actually a lot of Python love in the community when it comes to this. And it kind of makes sense, especially the JavaScript guys. You got a lot of front-end guys who are the ones who go and pick these. But especially at our company, we happen to be a company of mostly Python guys using Python frameworks. So you got a few front-end guys and a bunch of back-end guys, and it kind of can turn into a battle of, I want my JavaScript, I want my Python. So let's actually look at the Python things and see what they can offer us over some of those others. Some of the options, these are all very framework-specific ones. So they're integrate quite nicely with these web frameworks. So we have Django pipeline, which is just pretty basic asset packaging. Django for support for CSS and JavaScript. And then Django compressor. It's very similar. The main difference is the usage there. Where Django pipeline, you kind of build dictionaries of configuration and pass them through. Django compressor, you actually define all of your assets within templates. And then as the page is rendered, it actually compresses, and then from there on, it stays in that compressed state. If you're in Flask, there's Flask Funnel, which is another extension. And similar to in Pyramid, there's Pyramid Asset Compiler, which is pretty lightweight and focused. These are all actually really great tools, and if you spend your time in those frameworks, they're really definitely worth checking out.
But we like flexibility. We don't just work with Django, we don't just work with Flask, and we don't just work with Pyramid. We work with the right tool for the right job. So that's why we've chosen to use Webassets. So that's an open source framework written by Michael Elsdorfer, who's actually in the audience today. So if you have questions, he's the guy you can ask at the end. So Webassets gives us a nice way to reduce some of this pain. It works across frameworks, and it allows us to use this fairly unobtrusively with non-Python things as well, which is pretty nice.
So let's hop into some examples. Here initially, we're just going to focus on Django, using the Django assets helper that wraps web assets. But a lot of the examples here are pretty much straight copies of what you would do in Flask and Pyramid. So it's really simple to get set up. You're just going to pip install Django assets, and this will install that along with web assets. And then you just go into your settings.py, drop Django assets inside of your installed apps, and you've pretty much got it configured as much as you need. By default, it'll actually use a lot of Django's default settings. So a good example of that is the static files. So when you go into your Django settings and start mapping out your static files, that's what web assets will leverage to hunt down the assets when it's going to look to compile.
All right, so we have 3 ways to configure web assets, or more correctly, to tell web assets what to do with our assets. The first way we can do this is simply in our templates. We can define our asset bundles and the processing pipelines there. This is very similar to how Django compressor works. The second way is we can actually do this purely in Python using bundle objects to define our inputs, our filters, and then our output file. And then within your templates, you can reference those bundles so that they're properly linked. And the last way is you can use loaders, for instance, YAML. So with the YAML-based asset configuration, you define your asset bundles within YAML, and then you have a Python file to load those and make them available to your templates. So
First here, we're going to jump into templates only. So like Robert said, we just define all the assets in the templates. There's actually no Python needed in this scenario, and it's really nice for getting started, especially as you're building out and you're not sure what JavaScript, CSS you might use right away. And it's also nice even beyond that for small apps that have very fast compile time. You don't necessarily need to include a build step with those. So we're going to start with a less or SASS example here to get us some CSS. We actually like using less quite a bit. Seems much nicer than CSS. You actually get some variables. It makes it easier to break your files out. So all you'll do is install your favorite less compiler. There are actually quite a few of them. And then by default, web assets will point to the default install locations, but you can customize all of those through config options.
all right, so this is an example of what this might look like within a template. Here you can see that we define an asset bundle, we define the filters that we would like applied to our input files, and then we define the output file that will be written once this is applied. And then you also provide the template for the markup that will be inserted into your HTML template when this is processed.
So there's actually a settings.py flag in there, the debug mode. And when that is set to true, nothing actually happens. It just straight throws it across, doesn't apply the filters. So in this scenario, all of those less files you add just get converted over. They go through actually the less compiler and get converted to CSS. If we weren't using CSS or weren't using less and just using straight CSS, it would just straight go across. So like we said, this is great for development. We don't have these getting compressed down or getting compiled into one file right now. But then if we go set that flag to false, putting us in more of a production mode, it does actually do the bundling for us and give us one simple CSS file. And then you can actually see there's a little cache busting token that's inserted into the file name.
Yeah, the cache busting is very important. As probably most of you guys know, there's many layers of caching in between your application and your end users. And if you don't have good cache, first thing is you want the cache. That helps your app seem faster, and it helps reduce the load on your actual application servers, which is a very good thing. But having stale assets in your cache can lead to some really annoying problems and bad user experiences, so we don't want to do that. So there's actually two different styles of cache busting as well. The first is just to append some type of a hash or a cache busting token as a query string. That's not quite optimal though, because some things will not actually correctly cache the assets if they have any kind of query string. The better way to do it is actually to use something like a hash of the file contents as a piece of the file name, and that way it's pretty reliable for busting the cache when it should, but you can also set very aggressive caching options so that your assets have a higher probability of being cached close to your end users.
Yeah, and there's a bunch of configuration options for that as well, as simple even as just basing it off of your Django version number. So here, we're actually going to add an additional step. So we've converted from our less to our CSS. Now we want to drop this into a minification mode to get our file size smaller, using maybe like the closure compiler or CSS min.
Yeah, and this is an example of what that actually looks like in the templates. You can see the only difference here is that we've now added CSS min to our processing pipeline. So first it's going to apply less, and then to the bundle it'll apply the CSS min. Everything else remains the same. The input files, your output file, it's just adding more items to the pipeline.
So here's our results again in debug mode. It actually stays just like it was previously. You're not doing any of the minification, so it just does the less to the CSS, but then doesn't do minifying or bundling. So we're, once again, still in our good development mode here. If we pulled up the jQuery or the Chrome tools, we would see our files as we develop them. But then in production mode, just like before, it's bundled, but now it's also compressed. So our production code looks something like this.
Yeah, that's obviously pretty dense stuff, but the good thing is, again, that avoids extra downloads of either inflated or inflated downloads. Both of those things are good, especially with mobile applications, which are much more sensitive to latency of making new connections and things like that. So basically, it gives you a better mobile and desktop experience.
So that was basically all you need to do, asset bundling with the templates. It's obviously really, really simple. Some nice advantages is that you can actually have different definitions in each of your HTML files. So if you have different requirements in each file, you can easily configure them through there. Problem though is as your site grows, that could be quite the pain to manage. If you want to add or remove assets, or if you actually have some that are similar across the board, it's kind of annoying to have to go add them to each one.
All right, so that is where defining your bundles within Python comes into play. This makes it a little more flexible, actually a lot more flexible, but you get to define your bundles in some pretty clean and simple Python code. Getting started's pretty easy. Just create an assets.py in your application directory. By default, each application, not project, needs one assets file, so that's one thing to be aware of.
So in this scenario, we're actually going to use Coffeescript. Coffeescript's pretty nice. It has some flaws, obviously, but one thing it does is gives us some namespacing, and we can start breaking up our files a little easier. It handles dependency a little bit better, unless you're using something like require.js and JavaScript. But in this scenario, we're just going to compile our single square Coffeescript file into a simple JavaScript file.
All right, so this is an example of actually defining our Python bundle within, or our bundle within Python code. As you can see, it's pretty straightforward. We just import the bundle class and the register method. So if you're developing with Coffee, then one thing to note is it's going to use the version of Coffee that's actually on your path. You can change that with a configuration setting, but it's something to be aware of if you do work with multiple projects that need different versions or something like that. So the other thing is that if you're dealing with something like Coffeescript, you're also going to have JavaScript libraries, probably things like jQuery or Backbone.js, etc. So in that case, what you may want to do is actually define another bundle that will combine the results of your other two bundles. And this ability is something that's very, very important. This allows you to nest and chain to build really nice, complex, but valuable asset processing pipelines. So the other thing you can do with this in Python code, you can actually set up additional logic around the bundle creation so that if you're doing, for instance, a mobile build, you could swap out jQuery UI for jQuery mobile, but you could keep the same core libraries in that bundle.
So we still are actually using templates here to reference it, but unlike before, we're not listing out all of our assets. All we do is reference that bundle we created, and we just drop our script tag in pointing to that asset URL. Something of note, all of these templates are actually a nicety of this Django wrapper we're using. Flask and Pyramid have similar, and then there's actually also a Jinja plugin that'll give it, and then there's a Mako one in the pipe. But if you don't have access to any of those or you're using some other framework, you can actually do this all without using template references. There's an environment object you can pull out of Webassets that then you just register your assets against that. And then you go grab that bundle and just drop .urls on it, and you can get the URLs out of it. And that's the power of this asset management application, is actually just to take your assets and give yourself URLs that you can do things with.
All right, so continuing our example, let's convert that JavaScript that was output by our previous example to some really ugly JavaScript. You might want to do something like this, because in this example, that saves about 50 characters or 30%, which is obviously going to be pretty significant bandwidth savings.
So in this example, still on, there we go. In this example, it's actually the exact same setup as before. We have our Coffee and our JS bundles. But then in our combination bundle, we just add a JS min filter. So this way, everything will come out minified. There's actually another thing you can do here. A lot of times when we grab our third-party libraries, we might actually pull down their production minification code and not compile it ourselves. That's sometimes good, sometimes bad. I don't actually recommend it when you're in debugging, because then you got kind of a half and half. You've got their minified code and then your code, and you're stepping back and forth between them. One way we kind of get around that sometimes is we'll pull down both their debug mode or their dev mode and their production mode. And then in our bundles there, we just drop an if statement and we check if we're in debug, then use their dev version, or if we're in prod mode, use their production version. And then once again, don't compile it.
Yeah, you do that because some libraries, they've heavily optimized the production compression version, so it can actually be worth that small amount of additional pain. So in this case, the actual results within our HTML, once this has been processed, would look something like this. You'd wind up with, and this is a very important thing, as we've been talking about for the debugging, you actually get one output script tag included per input file. Now the important thing here is that in debug mode, these are still converted to JavaScript from Coffeescript, but the actual JS min filter will not be applied to them. So it's still the expanded version to make your debugging a little bit easier. There's also things such as source maps, the Chrome source maps that are in the works that are pretty good as well. So the production output is basically the same as we've seen previously. In this case, both filters will be applied, and you'll have a single output file that's been first compiled to JavaScript and then compressed. And it also will have the cache buster.
Yeah, so then you end up with this file. So this is your bundled and compressed JavaScript, which once again, we highly recommend using.
Yeah, So the pros and the advantages of actually defining your asset bundles within Python. It's nice, clean, simple code. It's really flexible. You can do nested bundles very easily. And if you would like to, you're able to actually define all of your bundles in a single place, or you can take advantage of the fact you're in Python and you could import those and things like that, normal Python. Disadvantage, it's not within templates. So if you're working and you have UI people or basically non-Python people maintaining your asset bundles, it may be a little more difficult for them, a slightly steeper learning curve.
Yeah, so that's one place where you could leverage the loaders with YAML and kind of do a combo approach. Here you would just put your assets inside a YAML file, which might be more easy for someone to get into, and then just load that in via Python.
Yeah, and this is an example of doing that for JavaScript templates. So say we had our client-side templates, and those need to be split up into separate files for maintainability, and then we're going to compile those into one single JST file.
Yeah, so this is all you need from the Python side. You're just going to load in your assets.yaml file that you're going to create, and once you've done that, it's pulled into memory. Beyond that, if you need to do any customization, you can. It's just in memory. You just reference those bundles, and you can do more features like we showed earlier. And then your YAML would just look something like this, pretty similar to what we were doing earlier, just within YAML. You can actually do nesting in here as well. You just do the standard YAML indentation. And in one place, especially with templates, you might want to do that. There's probably no need to have a separate templates.js file. You could probably just stick that at the top of your core JavaScript files, perhaps. So there you might want to nest this within that.
Within your actual templates, you still need to reference that bundle for inclusion, but this is basically exactly the same as if you had defined the bundle in your Python code. You just simply include the asset tag.
Yeah, and then your results, once again, pretty similar to earlier. In debug mode, you just get the one reference, the same in prod, just with the caching. There's not really a lot of difference with the JSTs, because no matter what, they have to be compiled into JavaScript from your template, or from your templates. And then, like I said, if you were to nest here, you would still just have these at the top of your core JavaScript file.
So the advantages of using the YAML method of declaring your asset bundles. First thing is you go back and you have your asset bundles declared in a single place, possibly in a single file. You can also separate any custom filters or custom processing logic that you have into Python code, keeping that separated from your actual asset bundle definitions. And the cons, of course, that means it's a little more complex, can be slightly more difficult to do certain types of things. And you do still need to use Python anyway, so you don't, it's not necessarily a con at this conference, but for some it might be.
So Webassets actually comes with a ton of included filters, everything UE, Closure, Uglify, SASS, Compass, Handlebars, and then even things like gzip and Jinja. Quite a few filters included out of the box. However, you can do some customization if you would like.
All right, so if you want to add a new filter to do something else, it's pretty straightforward. There's a real simple way to add an output filter. You just need to define a function that takes input, which is going to be the concatenated contents of the input files, and then defines the output, and then it takes the output, which you will write to. And then you can just use this within your bundles or within your assets, as we've seen all along.
Yeah, or there's actually a slightly more powerful filter. This also allows input filtering. Here you just input from Webassets filter object, and then define your input and output methods on that object. And then once again, it just hooks in, like we said before, you just can either reference that class or register it.
So customization, we have shown how to make custom filters, and we've alluded to the configuration. We'll talk just briefly about that. Your configuration could be done in your settings.py. By default, Django's defaults would be used, but you can configure it however you'd like. Things like your input and output location for your assets, your URL patterns, your cache controls, and the debug flag, of course.
Another thing it actually comes with is a manage.py command. Everything we've been doing here has kind of been assuming you have auto compile on. There's actually a flag to turn that on or turn that off if you'd like. With the manage.py command, you can actually just do a forced build. This could be handy if maybe you have local caching and you need to plow through that. You can also do template builds with parse templates flag. This is pretty useful also for CI systems and auto deployment. And then some other frameworks, there's obviously Flask, Pyramid, and then like I said earlier, if you can't use that, there's Jinja and Mako coming soon. And we're gonna do a quick Flask example here.
Yeah, Flask example looks basically just like what we've seen with Django. The difference here is we pass our Flask app into our assets environment, register the assets bundles. Go ahead. And then again, this looks about the same. The core difference here is with configuration. You can use Flask's configuration mechanisms rather than settings.py.
And if you don't have access to anything, any of those frameworks, we actually do quite a bit of Google App Engine work where we don't have access to the file system. So for us, we use the command line interface quite a bit. It's also pretty straightforward. You can set up logging, and then within this, like I said, you add your bundles just like before. But you can just manually run the build by running the script. It also comes with a watch mode, so you can get that auto save that you have with the others. This is actually also really useful, once again, for a CI or auto deployment system. And that is pretty much everything we had. Here's all of Michael's contributions. Definitely contribute if you can. We hope there's a lot going forward with it.
Thanks for coming out, guys. You can find our information there. If you have questions, we'll take them.
If you have questions, whoa, I talk louder than he does. If you have any questions, please line up behind the question stand there.
Hi. Thanks for the talk. That was really great. I'm wondering, I have a question about Clojure compiler. I saw it was in the filters. Last I checked, you download it, and it's like a Java jar file. So how does that get into your path, and how does it find that filter?
Like it's pretty or you just have a config option that you can go in and basically put the path in there. But yeah, you still have to pull down the jar and do all that. All of those kind of third-party executables that you need to use, you have the option to point directly to where they reside. But yeah, it's pretty straightforward. The Clojure compiler actually is a little, you really need to leverage configuration there because it can be obviously pretty aggressive. And it actually, Webassets will expose out a lot of the different ways you can set the Clojure compiler, the different modes. You can easily configure those as well.
Great, thank you.
Yep.
Just a quick question. Why would you choose to define the bundles in Python code rather than, let's say, some macros in the templating itself? Maybe that would be a little bit more in the right place. Would that make more sense?
Well, that was kind of the first examples we showed. It's kind of whatever way you want to go. Some of it, like the Django compressor, like he fully believes in that. That's his framework only supports that. Some of it's, well, like you said, you might not have the ability easily to do that. Some of the frameworks, App Engine, we don't have file systems, so we can't on the fly access it. We need to push already compressed files. So that might be one example. But
Would you recommend one approach over the other specifically?
a lot of it might depend on your build time. If you have really long build times and you're actually relying on that the first time a request comes in to compile on a new version, if that's a really big front-end application, it's probably better to pre-compile.
Thanks.
You might also do that depending on the complexity of the project you're working on. If you're defining those asset bundles within your templates like that, and you're using those same bundles in very different places for some reason, might be some additional overhead there.
But I mean, yeah, macros would work too. It's really just your preference. That's kind of the reason we like this library is it's open to all of it.
Thank you.
Yep.